At this point, we have already talked a little bit about a couple of those groups of Smriti teachings within Hinduism. Remember, we discussed the Vedas, the only Shruti teachings, that which is heard, signifying that non-human origin. And then we began to discuss the Smriti teachings. We started by looking at the epics. We looked at the Ramayana, we looked at the Mahabharata, especially the Bhagavad Gita. And then we also talked a little bit about the gods and goddesses and how they were viewed as we moved throughout the first millennium of the Common Era. And while we didn't, again, really address the Puranas, a lot of that information that is showing up about the gods and goddesses during that time of the formation of classical Hinduism is coming from those Puranas, the second category of Smriti teachings, those stories of the gods and goddesses or tales of the deities. So now we come to the third major grouping of Smriti teachings, the Dharmashastras. You can see the word Dharma in this term Dharmashastra, and of course you'll remember from our discussion of the Ramayana and the Bhagavad Gita that Dharma is relationship-specific moral obligation. In other words, this is how we ought to live in all of our different relationships that we have throughout our life. So the Dharma Shastras are basically just treatises or teachings on Dharma, right? And there were many different Dharma Shastras that were being composed by different people as we're making the transition from before the Common Era to the Common Era. By the opening centuries of the Common Era, we have quite a few of these Dharma Shastras in existence, and they're in some ways law books. They're teaching people how to live. They're teaching people the law of life based on various statuses and the way we relate to others as a result of our relationships. The most well-known of the Dharma Shastras is called the Laws of Manu. We haven't seen Manu's name pop up yet, but Manu is believed by some Hindu teachings to be something like the first man in our current cycle of existence. Remember back when we talked about the Trimurti, how we have a continuous cycle of creation and destruction. Manu would be the first man, kind of similar to Western tradition's understanding of Adam in the Hindu notion of the cycle of creation and the existence that we find ourselves in at this time. So the idea is that by calling this text about how we ought to relate to others the laws of Manu, it suggests that these laws are basically foundational to what it means to be human because they were there from the very beginning. The idea here is that these aren't being invented later on in time, but that they actually form the kind of bedrock of social relationships. Now, it's of course important to remember again, though, that these are Smriti texts, and therefore they can be challenged, they can be questioned in a lot of ways, despite what their title seems to suggest about their importance. Manu was that first man. Like being Adam, he also has a little bit of an interesting comparison with Noah. We didn't say a lot more about Vishnu when discussing his role throughout Hinduism, but Vishnu is somewhat unique among some of the other gods and goddesses in that he actually takes on physical form. We saw that actually in the Bhagavad Gita, where we talked about Krishna as being an earthly incarnation of Vishnu. Those incarnations are known as avatars. And you could think of that big movie, the Avatar movie that was out several years ago with those blue people, and the one guy kind of enters into their world. Well, that was called Avatar in connection with these avatars, these incarnations primarily of Vishnu. And Vishnu is said to have had a certain number of incarnations in our current cycle of existence, and his final incarnation we're still waiting for. But one of his first incarnation, according to most lists, is when he came as a fish to help save Manu from a great flood. Right. Then we see later incarnations like Krishna from the Gita. Although we didn't mention this when discussing the Ramayana, it does become the belief that Ram was another of the incarnations of Vishnu. And interestingly, on some of the lists of the avatars of Vishnu, we see the Buddha, the historical Buddha. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in another video, but it's an interesting way in which Hindus perhaps tried to explain away Buddhism as it became an alternative rival religious tradition in India at a certain time in history. They kind of attempted to explain it away by saying the Buddha was simply a negative incarnation of Vishnu, someone who came to kind of test people by teaching things that were not ultimately true, right? So again, that's just kind of a little bit of information here about Manu and why giving this Dharma Shastra that title suggests a great deal of importance and truth about how we relate to others by fulfilling our dharmas. Now, much of what you read about in the Dharmashastras, and especially in the laws of Manu, is about the distinctions that exist within society. And those different distinctions give us different statuses or identities, and those cause different dharmas, right, that we have in our life based on those statuses. And perhaps most importantly within this system are the distinctions caused by caste. Now, we already mentioned the caste system back when we talked about the hymn to the Supreme Person, and we saw that the four kind of castes were part of, or at least believed to be part of, the creation of humanity from the very beginning through the sacrifice of that cosmic person. Now, the word that is used for those four castes generally is varnas, and you can see that typed in here. And these are the four varnas. Just kind of worry about the Sanskrit on just the first, because it's the one that you hear most frequently in the Sanskrit. The others are, I think, more often translated into English. But the first, the Brahmin caste. Right? We mentioned this in that earlier video as the priestly caste. Now, this gets a little bit tricky because if you're looking at this word Brahmin, you see that it looks very close to Brahman with an A-N at the end. Remember Brahman, that impersonal, abstract, supreme being of the Upanishads, who also shows up again in the Bhagavad Gita in the second path to liberation. It also looks close to Brahma, the god of creation in the Trimurti. So these three terms, a little tricky. You got to really work on kind of remembering the spelling to keep these terms separate from one another. So this is Brahmin. This is the priestly caste. Then you have the warrior caste, sometimes referred to as the ruler caste. Then the merchant or producer caste. And then the servant caste. And again, you're born into this caste. It's not something you kind of achieve throughout your life. You're born into a particular caste. And according to the laws of Manu, the caste that you are born into determines quite a bit about the opportunities that you will have in life, the obligations that you have toward the other castes, for example. And then what we see by the time of the Dharmashastras is that these castes are broken down even further into what are really thousands of different distinctions that are often referred to as jatis, or birth groups. And these jatis, or birth groups, are often connected to occupations, so that you're born not only into a particular caste, but you're born into an occupation. Therefore, as a boy, for example, and we'll see that gender plays a big role here, there will be an expectation for you to continue in the line of work of your father because you are born into that jati, not only that varna, that caste, right? So again, you're going to see a lot of what really becomes discrimination based on caste throughout the laws of Manu. For example, members of the servant caste, according to some of the Dharmashastras, are not allowed to own land. So you see that kind of discrimination based on caste distinction. And as I just mentioned, you also see a lot of gender discrimination within the laws of Manu and the Dharmashastras. And it is important to recognize what's going on at this time in history, that you have some of this social stratification, you have some of this social discrimination. It's actually a bit of a setback for women who had actually enjoyed a little bit of a higher status during the Vedic time period. Remember, we're now talking about kind of the transition into that first millennium of the Common Era. So back in the 1500 to 600 BCE time period, women actually had more opportunities, more freedoms. Again, nothing approaching kind of perfect equality. We're going to have to wait a long time in history in all societies to really seek that. But still, there was a higher status for women. Women were even involved in some of the discussions that led to the Upanishads, it seems, and maybe involved in the oral transmission of the various Vedic teachings from generation to generation. By the time we get to the Dharmashastras, it is clear that women have kind of taken that step back. They've been pushed back by society, and now written into the laws of Manu are a lot of kind of discriminations against women. There's a little clip you can find on YouTube, or if you are a fan of the show, of The Big Bang Theory, where Raj, the Indian scientist who is Hindu, has his sister visiting. And his sister is always kind of in this on-again, off-again relationship with one of the other scientists. And you see Raj being very upset about his sister wanting to date one of his friends. And he is speaking very much like the laws of Manu throughout much of the episode, saying, you must stay out here where I can observe you if you're going to be together, because it is inappropriate for a woman to entertain a man in private. That's a lot of that kind of gender discrimination language that you would get from the laws of Manu. And what's really interesting in that episode is that eventually they're all at lunch together, and Sheldon, the lead figure, kind of interrupts the discussion. And this is right after Raj's sister says that Raj doesn't have any control over who she dates. And Sheldon interrupts and says, actually, he does. The Hindu code of Manu, and he's talking about the laws of Manu, is really clear on this, that it is up to the closest male relative to control a woman's base desires. Right? And if she refuses to accept their control, Sheldon says, she will be reborn in the womb of a jackal and be tormented by diseases. Right? So he's quoting from the laws of Manu, and you can see that kind of male dominance that shows up in that teaching, in the Dharmashastras in general. Right? So it's important to recognize some of this caste and gender discrimination. However, it is also important to recognize that these are Smriti teachings. And as I said, they can be challenged and questioned and rejected. And we know that even at that time in history, in those opening centuries of the first millennium of the Common Era, when the Dharmashastras probably would have been at their most important level for many Hindu communities, we know that many of those discriminations were not always followed. For example, we know of a group of servants, members of the servant caste, who were actually very wealthy landowners, despite that prohibition against members of the servant caste owning land. So we know that they were not always followed closely, especially in some of their more discriminatory moments. Remember that much of what you find in the Dharmashastras will just be a lot of kind of moral teaching about how children relate to parents and how husbands relate to wives and things like that, friends relate to friends. And it doesn't always have to incorporate any kind of this discriminatory language. But the discriminatory stuff is there, but it's important to remember that it was not always followed closely. And certainly, as we move forward into time and enter into more recent times and the contemporary setting, we don't want to read a line from the laws of Manu and assume that if you are a Hindu, you believe entirely in what that is saying. Just like we wouldn't assume that a Christian believes literally in every exact thing that is showing up in the Bible as applying to every other future moment and time period. And the same thing we would say about members of other religious traditions. It is important to contextualize things and realize that traditions are living. They change over time. And many Hindu women, for example, would be just like Raj's sister and scoff, roll her eyes at what Sheldon says from the laws of Manu. Right? So keep all of that in mind. Also within the laws of Manu and the Dharmashastras more generally, you get a discussion of the 4 stages of Hindu life. Now, because of some of that discriminatory male-dominant language, we're really only focusing here on boys and men. And because of some of the discrimination surrounding caste, we'll see that we're really only focusing on men of the upper 3 castes. So we'll see that right away. The first stage of Hindu life, according to the laws of Manu, is the student stage. In other words, this is these teachings kind of explaining what it is to actually live a proper Hindu life, what stages you go through as you fulfill your various dharmas at different moments of your life. So the student stage is the first stage, and it is entered into with an initiation ritual that is called the Upanayana, which is typed for you here on the screen. This is the initiation ritual into the student stage of life. There's actually a kind of ritual cleansing ceremony that is used here. And I might have even mentioned this back when talking about the great baths of the Indus Valley civilization, that we would eventually find a kind of ritual cleansing practice that is part of Hinduism. And here it is with the initiation ritual into the student stage of life. In a sense, this was a rebirth to being a son of a teacher rather than just the son of your father, because as a student, you will now go and live traditionally with a teacher, and you will learn not only things like reading and perhaps mathematics, but you will learn the Vedas. And this is your chance to study the Vedas. Now, again, to show some of the kind of shift in society, we have evidence that prior to the Dharmashastras, the student stage was, of course, being performed, but we have evidence that boys and girls of the upper 3 castes were allowed to become students. But with the Dharmashastras and that stronger gender discrimination that comes with them, it is said that only boys of the upper three castes are allowed to become students and therefore study the Vedas, right? And for the rest of this list here, we're really referring only to those individuals. So the second stage is the householder stage. This is just what it sounds like. This is when the boy would finish with the student stage, would graduate in a sense, and then get married. And once married, would have children and have a job to support his family. So it's that stage of domestic dharmas, domestic responsibilities of being a husband and a father, right? After that time period, when the kids are raised and off in their own householder settings, this is when the laws of Manu says that the man should enter the third stage, which is the stage of a forest dweller. The idea here is that the man is going to kind of partially retire from all of his social obligations and spend some time literally in the forest engaging in spiritual retreat. And if he's still married, his wife can go along with him, but it's a time for him to kind of pull back. Maybe he retires from his job, or at least partially does so. He pulls back at times from his friendships and spends some time in the forest in order to kind of get back on that spiritual path that began as a student when he studied the Vedas. And then you have the fourth stage, the stage of the renunciant. And this is when the Dharmashastras say that a man should completely renounce all dharmas. Right? The idea is that this is a total kind of retirement from life, from social life, in order to focus exclusively on spiritual progress and attaining liberation. Right? Now, of course, what's interesting is that this is showing up right around the beginning of the Common Era, just about at the same time that the Bhagavad Gita is being composed and beginning to be circulated. And remember what Krishna told Arjuna when Arjuna said, well, the answer must be to completely renounce all of my actions, all of my dharmas. And Krishna said, no, you must never renounce action. You must always fulfill your dharmas. You just must do so selflessly. Remember that first path, the karma yoga. So there's a little bit of a conflict there. The laws of Manu is suggesting that in order to really try to reach liberation, you have to renounce all relationships. The idea here is that you would actually die a social death. You would be dead to family members, friends. You would have no more contact with them because the Dharmashastras suggest that that is necessary in order to make spiritual progress. Remember, Krishna says, no, that's actually the wrong approach to making spiritual progress. So that as everybody was still trying to figure things out here, you have a little bit of a conflict, and it seems to be that the Bhagavad Gita, or at least that idea, wins out, because we have very little evidence of most men actually moving beyond the householder stage. Even though the laws of Manu puts this out here as the ideal journey for a Hindu man seeking spiritual enlightenment, it is not something that was practically followed by really much of anyone. But yet it's there, again, showing us how the Dharmashastras are kind of really trying to solidify or maybe rigidify what it means to live life well in terms of the relationships, in terms of our spiritual pursuits. And that's where you see a lot of these teachings, some of which are very benign and helpful to this day, some of which are more discriminatory and were not even followed then and have been largely abandoned by most Hindus to this day. Right? So that's a little bit of information about the Dharmashastras. In the next video, we'll say a little bit more and look at another brief list about the 4 aims of the Hindu life that kind of work right along with those 4 stages.